You don't need me to tell you that living conditions in the 16th century were pretty grim, even for the wealthy. In some parts of society, sewage flowed in the streets, electricity was but a distant myth, warmth, security, and in some cases a full belly were merely fairy tales, as many poor folk and urchins suffered in cold poverty, hungry and desperate. Whilst it sounds horrific, this was the reality for many living in Bavaria, Germany, amongst other places in Europe. As if that wasn't bad enough, there was always the ever-present threat of werewolves, demons, and of course, witches, those that congregated in the night and struck at the innocent and the God-fearing. For the most part, the poor dregs of society were regarded more like insects than anything else, insignificant, irrelevant, and often in the peripherals of those who were better off. Even as we look back on the common labourer, or worse, the beggars and vagrants, we don't have much to go off in terms of their own personal accounts. Often this was due to the fact that such men and women were not learned people and did not have access to an education. Therefore, they could not read or write, and so much of the harshities in their lives were shared with no one and followed them to their graves in silent secrecy. Indeed, much of history is written this way, and we are quick to forget the drifters and the paupers on the account that they simply did not have a voice back then, nor a platform to express the direness of their existence. In fact, the only time the seemingly ordinary man and woman got their lives recorded was when they'd done something wrong, or been accused of doing something wrong, that which would have the effect of making them rather extraordinary indeed, and immortalizing them thereafter, though not necessarily in the way they'd have liked. It is under such circumstances that the Gampel family, otherwise known as the Pappenheimers, were unearthed from the crevices of dark history, and laid bare for us to conceive the reality of one of the most gruesome witchcraft trials that had ever taken place. The Pappenheimers were about as unremarkable as you could get. Paulus, the head of the household, was a labourer in a town brickyard, a 57-year-old man who you might say, given the time period and the living conditions, was well aware that there were more years behind him than there were ahead. He was likely winding down from the laborious nature of his work, and was likely more in the mind to take up the work of his father-in-law, the town's gravedigger in Ansbach. Paulus, who had married his wife Anna at the age of 18, pretty much married into what was a good prospect at the time, on the account that people always needed to be buried, and so there was always money at hand to be made. Though considering the nature of the job, Anna's father and her family were thought to have been shunned by society, and were only spoken to when the services of undertaking were required. While such services were necessary, the job itself was considered by some to be dishonourable, uncanny, and possibly even pertaining to a supernatural disposition. Anna, who would have difficulty socialising and making connections because of her father's work, probably saw Paulus as her one and only chance at achieving love and starting a family of her own. Paulus, who was something of a wanderer himself, and possibly a beggar as a result of being an illegitimate child, may have seen the same prospects in Anna, and so the two were married. Together they had 3 sons, Gumprecht, who was 22 years of age, Michael, who was 20, and Hansel, who was 10. Despite their meagre roots and troubling upbringings, there is some virtue in this story already, given that they were able to start and maintain a family at all. But things were about to take a dark turn for the family in question. After the death of Anna's father, Paulus did not inherit the family business. They ended up moving from Ansbach and sought greener pastures in Nuremberg, only to find a lack of available work and perhaps even poorer living conditions than Ansbach. Whilst it is unknown what type of work they were hoping to find here in this new city, they, like many others, resorted to begging. Strangely enough, begging was actually regulated by the authorities in Germany, and in the area of Nuremberg, nearly 1,000 people were registered as beggars. Indeed, if one was to beg in various communities, they would need a permit to do so, otherwise it was illegal. Having come from Ansbach, the Gampel family, amongst other foreigners or outsiders, were unable to obtain a license to beg, and were therefore now in an even worse state. They weren't just beggars, they were outlaws. begging for those without a license was illegal, but as you might imagine, that didn't stop people from, well, begging. It wasn't like they had much of a choice, and for the Gamble family, the same was especially true, given the extra mouths to feed. Given that this system of monitoring the beggars was so tightly regulated, it wasn't long before the Gambles were caught by the authorities and evicted. Though, this did not stop them and many others from returning. It is understood that they were able to acquire forged licenses and move from town to town in hopes of either continuing to live off the land, so to speak, or to find work. Work did eventually find Paulus, though not exactly the type of glamorous work that one would hope for. However, it sure made brickwork and undertaking glamorous enough by comparison. Paulus became acquainted with a wanderer who emptied privies for a living, and before long, he became the man's assistant in removing waste from toilets. Now, cesspits were something of a recent invention in the 16th century, but they were a welcome innovation in a time where chamber pots were used and the contents was pretty much just thrown out the window. As you can imagine though, like undertaking, the privy emptying business was also a dishonourable one, or at least one that was looked down upon by others. But it wasn't like Paulus had much of a choice. He had a family to feed, and so he took the job as the privy emptier's assistant until he eventually became the sole privy emptier himself. The term for this luxurious profession amongst the locals was Pappenheimer, and so Paulus and his poor family became known as the Pappenheimers, which is a bit better than being known as the, turd burglars? Poop handlers? Stool snatchers? In any case, it wasn't a complimentary title, and you can imagine the amount of shit, no pun intended, that the family would have gotten from their fellow townsfolk. The family continued their work from town to town, and as you can imagine, there was no shortage of work, given the nature of this career. It was often done in the nocturnal hours so as to avoid causing offence, and probably to avoid some senseless jab from fellow neighbours. But it would also cause the Gambles to become recluses. Not only were they constantly travelling from town to town, but they weren't exactly keen to start socialising with anyone given their reputation. Considering their work took place mainly at night, there weren't exactly many people to go about forming relationships with anyway. As a result, a sense of mystery fell upon the Gambles, who shuffled about quietly in the nighttime, keeping themselves to themselves. Still, they were able to secure other odd jobs around the towns, and before long were able to establish something of a local beat, a pattern of households that they would regularly attend. Anna was able to get work as a maid, and Paulus would take advantage of a gambling table that he was able to use to make some extra money. Begging wasn't off the cards exactly, but for the most part, they were able to put together enough to keep themselves fed, clothed, and sheltered, which is more than many in their position could say. The family lived like this for over 2 decades, and with 2 of their sons becoming old enough to work, they were in a far better position. They were able to form connections, despite their unfortunate line of work, and were even able to afford accommodation. Things were looking up. But after 2 decades of balancing on the tightrope of poverty and more poverty, the Pappenheimers were arrested after having been accused of the murdering of 7 pregnant women. The reason for the allegations are not clear, but some suggest this was because Paulus had a fight with a thief, and that after their altercation, the thief accused Paulus and his family as being the murderers of what would have been something of a high-profile case. Another account suggests that the thief was the murderer, and after having been caught, implicated the Pappenheimers as a way of selfishly taking down someone with him. A more insidious account states that the thief declared the Pappenheimers had helped him with the murders, and that they had murdered pregnant women so as to obtain unbaptized fetuses to use in the making of candles. In the middle of the night, their accommodation, likely a cheap tavern, was stormed by the authorities, and they were taken from their beds and placed under arrest. Now, of course, the accusation had no weight, and the thief had no evidence to suggest that Paulus or his family even knew these women in question. But because Paulus and his family were a family of beggars, illegal ones at that, the normal lawful procedure at the time was to evict them from the town after a stint in jail. The family would of course be separated, and the youngest son Hansel, merely 10 years of age, would be torn from his parents and left to fend for himself. Prisoners weren't exactly treated with grace either, but beggar prisoners were treated with nothing less than contempt. Conditions would have been subpar, perhaps even dangerously unhygienic. Those in custody were often neglected of food, warmth, and general human decency, and not to mention the psychological strain that such conditions could incur. But unfortunately for the Pappenheimers, an even worse fate awaited them. The accusation by the thief was bad enough as it was, but it also came about during a time when fear of witchcraft was brewing in Europe. The idea that witches were scuttling in the darkness, sacrificing babies to the devil, and casting spells of wickedness was fast becoming a very real threat. Maximilian I, the Elector of Bavaria, was amongst those who succumbed to the hysteria in the 17th century, and so he did not hesitate to have the Pappenheimers taken to Munich, where they were subject to extreme torture. Now, when I say extreme torture, I'm really not exaggerating. For those of the faint of heart, you might want to skip ahead a few minutes, or maybe even read up on it yourself when you're ready. Basically, viewer discretion is advised going forward. So, the fact that the Pappenheimers were accused of murdering the pregnant women and using the unbaptized fetuses for their own craft made them a shoo-in for practitioners of witchcraft. After arriving in Munich, the authorities did not hold back with their torture in an effort to get the family to confess to the crime. As mentioned, the torture was extreme, so extreme that they each confessed to everything and anything, even to crimes they had not been convicted of. They confessed to several thefts, robberies, murders, pretty much every unsolved crime that Bavaria had to offer. Under further torture, Anna would come to confess to a varied set of sickening activities, including making a powder out of the hands of dead children, and flying on a piece of wood to meet the devil himself. Before long, the family had a combined account of some of the most profound and bizarre sorcery tales that Bavaria had ever known. They had confessed to being devoted to Satan himself, and that with his help, they were able to make a magic ointment that when applied to the body would cause death. It was this ointment that would be deemed as responsible for the death of over 400 children and more than 50 of the elderly after having apparently come into contact with the substance. In addition to this, they also confessed to acts of robbery, theft, and burglary, where they supposedly admitted to murdering the occupants if they were caught. The charges also specified that they were arsonists and would ignite flames in various parts of the town in order to disguise their getaways. They were also charged with the conjuring of bad weather, the murdering of cows, and the robbing of church artifacts, which they reportedly sold to the devil, other witches, or even Jews. They were even forced to confess over 400 names of various accomplices, some of which probably weren't even witches, and some who probably weren't even real, all because they were desperate to see an end to the torture. Unfortunately, this would see many of their friends and associates arrested, accused, and tortured as well, in what would become a vicious, appalling cycle of brutalities and death. Having made their confessions, the Pappenheimers were denied freedom and sentenced to death. At a public execution, which was attended by thousands, a procession that reportedly went on for half a mile long was assembled. Paulus was brutally mutilated by red-hot pincers that plucked out chunks of his flesh. He then had both of his arms broken on the wheel being a popular form of torture and punishment in France and Germany. Similarly to a crucifixion, the victim was stripped and then tied to a large wheel. There, stretched across its spokes and hub, the victim would receive blows from an executioner, usually via an iron bar. The executioner's job was simple: to shatter the limbs one by one. A skilled executioner was thought to be able to smash the bones of his victim without piercing the skin, and this horrid form of punishment would often take place starting from the feet, before working up the rest of the body to the head. The wheel was then propped up so that onlookers could witness the gruesome work of the executioner and could appreciate the mangled limbs of the victim. Paulus suffered such a fate and had both of his arms broken on the wheel, but usually the executioner would be instructed to end the suffering by striking the chest or the head, thus putting the victim out of their misery. This mercy, though, was not offered to Paulus, and he was then impaled by a pike, reportedly through the anus. He was then tied to the stake. Meanwhile, his wife Anna was mutilated in perhaps one of the most horrendous ways possible. Her breasts were cut off and then savagely rubbed in the faces of her 2 adult sons and smeared in their mouths. There seemed to be no apparent reason for such indecency, other than to absolutely terrorize and torment them. The 2 oldest sons then had their flesh ripped apart 6 times by irons, before being executed along with 2 other men. As if that wasn't diabolical enough, the authorities made Hansel, the 10-year-old survivor of the family, watch as his parents and older brothers were mutilated and then taken by the fires. Apparently, he was brought along to the execution by horse and forced to watch, also that his reaction could be documented by the officials. Hansel, again a 10-year-old boy, would remember his parents and his older brothers bloodied, battered and broken as a confusing chorus of church hymns chanting townsfolk and the screams of his family sounded off around him. It was a day that the people of Bavaria celebrated God triumphing over Satan yet again, but for Hansel, it was a day that he watched his loved ones burn alive. Hansel himself was not executed right away. There doesn't seem to be a reason as to why his execution was delayed. Some ideas suggest that the authorities had taken pity on the boy, given his youth, and that he was rebaptized and renamed as Cyprian. However, in just 3 months, he was brought to a second public execution and burned at the stake. It is thought that because of his rebaptizing, he was at least given the mercy of strangulation before being burned. Unfortunately, this would be only one of the many witchcraft trials set to follow in the wake of an overzealous duke in Maximilian I, who was dead set on stamping out such ungodliness. In the Pappenheimers, Maximilian had set the precedent of what was to happen if someone dared to practice witchcraft, and it need not be said that it surely dissuaded anyone from being even curious over the dark arts. Still, the authorities issued pamphlets in the wake of the gruesome trial in order to justify why it was they had been so merciless and why the Pappenheimers were indeed deserving of such extremity. After publishing the pamphlets, the entire matter was dropped, and the memory of the Pappenheimers receded into the darkest crevices of Bavaria, its citizens perhaps just as eager to forget about it as the government. Let me know in the comments below what you thought about quite possibly the most monstrous witchcraft trial we've covered on this channel, and maybe even the most gruesome trial in history. As always, don't forget to give this video a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe for more content just like this. Till next time.